this is a continuation of Ronnie's lesson from last week about the priesthood under the Old Testament law. We learned last week how God had separated Aaron and his sons and called them to the profession of priest, and how Moses, under God's direction, had dressed them in priestly garments. We continue to read. If you continue to read, I think last week's lesson was in chapter 7. If you read 7, 8, 9, we learned how God commanded that Aaron and his sons stay in the tabernacle for 7 days to be cleansed. And after that was completed, Moses holds this inauguration for them as priests, where he sacrifices goats and a calf, a lamb, a ram, an ox. He sacrifices grain. He takes the blood from the sacrifices and puts them on the altar. All these rituals are going on so that Aaron and his sons might be consecrated, might be made holy for their service to God in the temple. Right. And it seems like things are going pretty well at the end of chapter 9. It says, Aaron lifted up his hand toward the people and blessed them, and came down from offering of the sin offering and the burnt offering and peace offerings. And Moses and Aaron went into the tabernacle of the congregation and came out and blessed the people. And the glory of the Lord appeared unto all the people. And there came a fire from before the Lord, and consumed upon the altar the burnt offering and the fat, which when all the people saw, they shouted and fell on their faces. Things going so good. The Spirit of God appears as a consuming fire to eat up those sacrifices. The people shout and fall on their faces. The Spirit of God is so present in that moment. But it's about to take a turn for the worse. In chapter 10, verse 1, it says, And Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, took either of them his censer, which was like a container that you would burn incense in, and put fire therein, and put incense thereon, and offered strange fire before the Lord, which he commanded them not. And there went out fire from the Lord, and devoured them, and they died before the Lord. Then Moses said unto Aaron, This is that the Lord spake, saying, I will be sanctified in them that come nigh me, and before all the people I will be glorified. And Aaron held his peace. And Moses called Mishael and Elzaphan, the sons of Uzziel, the uncle of Aaron, and said unto them, Come near, carry your brethren from before the sanctuary out of the camp. So they went near and carried them in their coats out of the camp, as Moses had said. Moses said unto Aaron and to Eleazar and to Ithamar his sons, Uncover not your heads, neither rend your clothes, lest ye die, and lest wrath come upon all the people. But let your brethren, the whole house of Israel, bewail the burning which the Lord hath kindled. And he shall not go out from the door of the tabernacle of the congregation, lest ye die. For the anointing oil of the Lord is upon you. And they did according to the word of Moses. Now I should acknowledge stories like this, where God burns up people who don't do things exactly by the letter of the law, are quite unsettling to read. Especially when we consider in the New Testament, Jesus' entire focus is on mercy and love. It can be difficult to balance these two things, these two sides of God that we see in the Old and New Testament. And I don't claim to understand it all, but I think we can at least reason through what is happening here. There is a key to understanding what happens in the Old Testament. God, in the book of Exodus, in the book of Genesis, really, with Abraham, we see that he enters into a special relationship with this nation called Israel. And part of a relationship like he has never entered into a relationship like that with any nation before, and he's never done it since. The United States of America is not privy to the promises and the judgments that God made to Israel. It was a special relationship. One of a kind. The only one that's ever occurred. And part of the condition of that relationship, you read this in the book of Exodus, God told Moses that if you obey me, if the people obey me, I will bless them. If they disobey me, I will curse them. And either way, whether I bless them or curse them, the nations of the world will know that I am the God of Israel because of my judgment or my blessings. Right. That was an arrangement particular to Israel. It is also worth noting that that condition, I think, can be applied to these Aaron's and his sons being called from that blessed nation of Israel to serve a special purpose, to stand in the gap between God and his people. With that responsibility, as the Spider-Man movies say, with great power comes great responsibility. So, of course, Aaron and his sons would be held to a higher standard than the rest of the people because they were doing a very important work. Again, serving as the go-between between God and his people. And thus they would suffer, if they were disobedient, more severe consequences for that disobedience. Now, what did Aaron's sons do wrong in particular? The King James Version translates it as they offered strange fire. The Hebrew word for strange can also be translated as unauthorized or profane. I've also seen it translated as unholy, meaning fire not created or presented to God in accordance with God's law, God's rules. It also says that they offered fire before the Lord, which he commanded them not. Yeah. Maybe they were doing something outside the ritual that God had prepared for them. They were in themselves. They were trying to show off in themselves. We don't know exactly. These are all possibilities. Some believe that we see that they take fire and put it in their censers. Maybe the problem was that they were trying to make their own fire instead of using the fire that God had sent from heaven just a few verses before. It's possible that they had too much wine and in their drunkenness had messed something up. We see in the same chapter in verse 8 that God tells Aaron not to partake of strong drink or wine when he's in the office of the priest, that lest ye die. So maybe that was the problem. Whatever the problem was, whatever they did wrong, they were invoking the presence of God, and without doing it in an appropriate way, without adequately cleansing themselves, they could not stand in the presence of an all-good, all-knowing, all-just God. In their unholiness, the presence of God had no other choice but to consume them as a fire. The Bible tells us that no man has seen God. When Moses asked to see God, God said, you couldn't do it. You could not look upon my face and live. So he allowed Moses to see his backside as he passed by. I think this is another key to understanding a lot of what happens in the Old Testament. I've referenced it a few times already. The writer of Hebrews in the New Testament, chapter 12, verse 29, describes our God as a consuming fire. The love of God and the judgment of God emanate from the same place. I'll say that again. The love of God and the judgment of God come from the same place. Really, they are the same thing. They are part of the goodness of God. His judgment and love are both part of the goodness of God. I think parents would understand this. The hugs and kisses and cuddles that I give my little girl come from the exact same place as the times when I put her in timeout or ground her from a toy. It comes from the same place. Yeah. It comes from my desire for what is best for my child. Even if she doesn't feel like it all the time. It comes from my love for her. So the love of God and the judgment of God, this is a hard thing for people to get, but they are essentially the same thing. The presence of God is so powerful. His goodness and His judgment are so strong that just being in the presence of God, we are overwhelmed with that goodness, so much so that sinful human beings cannot withstand it. The same sun in the sky that helps the flowers grow is also the same one that parches the grass. It's the same thing, but it's the intensity of it. And yet God has never desired, I've said this so many times, there is not one thing that God needs or desires except the one thing that we can give him, which is a relationship with us. Right. So how does God balance out these things? How does he dwell with us and have a relationship with us as he has always desired, and yet punish the evil and the brokenness that we bring into the world? How does he balance his judgment and his love? Because think about it. If you knew of a judge, somebody that worked in the courthouse, that only sometimes applied the law, that only sometimes carried out justice, that only sometimes gave victims the justice that they needed, he only did that sometimes, you would say that that was not a very good judge. And if God only sometimes picked and chose which people he punished and which people he judged and let others off scot-free, we would say that was not a very, very good God. If God is truly good, and God is truly all-powerful, he must punish sin. He has to, or else he would not be a good God. And the bad part of that is, we are the cause of sin. Right. That's the problem of the whole thing. And yet, God also is all-loving. God is also consumed with love for mankind. He loves us unconditionally. Right. Loves us more than we could comprehend. Again, this is something I didn't truly understand until I became a father. You could not have described to me that I could love somebody the way that I love my little girl. A love that I would do anything in the world for. I've loved a lot of other people in my lifetime, but this is different. And then Jesus tells people, if you, being evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more must the Father love you? God is all-powerful, all-knowing, all good in his judgment, and must punish sin, and yet he is all-loving. How would he balance these two things? How could he love us and judge us at the same time without destroying us? This is the question that was on the mind of the writer of Hebrews. Ronnie quoted from that book last week. Dad quoted from it Wednesday. I think the book of Hebrews in the New Testament is one of the best tools that we have for understanding, along with the writings of Paul, specifically in Romans, but Hebrews too. One of the best tools we have for understanding the relationship between the Old Testament law and the new covenant, the New Testament that comes through Jesus. How does God balance his love and his judgment? Well, Hebrews chapter 2 verse 9 tells us, it says, we see Jesus, who was made a little lower than the angels for the suffering of death, crowned with glory and honor, that he, by the grace of God, should taste death for every man. We see Jesus, who was made a little lower than the angels, that he, by the grace of God, should taste death for every man. As I said, the problem that Nadab and Abihu faced here was that they were trying to stand in front of God unprepared. Unprepared, on their own. Right. They stood unworthily in the presence of the Almighty God. They stood in themselves in the presence of God, that consuming fire that the writer of Hebrews wrote about, ended their lives. They stood in front of the judgment of God and the love of God and could not withstand it. Right. But in the form of Jesus, God himself steps into the path of his own righteousness, steps into the path of his own judgment to provide a firewall between God and man. Jesus became our new high priest, serving as the go-between for God and man. See, what Aaron's sons there were doing, they were offering incense. And I find it so interesting that a lot of religions in that area of the world at the same time did things the same way. It's like God was speaking to his people through a language they understood. They would offer incense, and the incense was a symbol of a veil, an unseen veil between God and his people. That smoke and scent that would hang in the air was a sign of a separation between God and his people, which is what Aaron's sons needed. But now we no longer have to worry about needing incenses or veils to separate us from God, sacrifices to act as go-betweens between us and God and the pure goodness and righteousness of God. Now we have a high priest that is always on the job. The writer of Hebrews says in chapter 7, such a high priest became us who is holy. I like this. Harmless, undefiled, separate from sinners, made higher than the heavens, who needeth not daily, as those high priests, to offer up sacrifice, first for his own sins, and then for the people's. For he did once, when he offered up himself. Yeah. For the law makes man high priest, which have infirmity, which have sins, which have shortcomings. Right. But the word of the oath, which was since the law, maketh the Son, talking about Jesus, of course, consecrated forevermore. In his first epistle, the Apostle John tells us that when we sin, we have an advocate with the Father, someone who will plead our case in the courts of heaven. Mm-hmm. We no longer need to fear standing in the presence of God, because we are not standing as Nadab and Abihu were. We are not standing on our own. We no longer need to fear that, because Jesus has dressed us in his righteousness. Right. Hebrews chapter 4 says, let us therefore come boldly unto the throne of grace, dressed in Jesus' righteousness, dressed in his goodness, and not our own. We can approach God the Father, and that all-consuming fire, instead of killing us, instead warms our hearts and feeds our souls. There are people in this world who at the end of time, at the day of judgment, will attempt to stand before the presence of an all-good, an almighty, all-knowing, all-loving God on their own. There are people who will say, no, that's okay, Jesus. I'm going to try this on my own. I'm going to try this by myself. Right. And let me tell you what would happen to me if I tried that. Our righteousness is as filthy rags, the writer of Isaiah said. There is nothing on my best day. On my best day, I am not worthy to stand in front of an almighty, all-knowing, all-wise, all-powerful, all-good, and all-loving God. Because the same presence that consumed the sons of Aaron would consume me. Mm-hmm. I am not nearly perfect enough, not nearly, to stand before God on my own. This is what people don't understand. The law was created just as in the beginning God paraded all of creation in front of Adam. Read Genesis 2. He parades all of creation in front of Adam before he gives him Eve. God says, I'll make him a helpmate. But he doesn't go straight on and create Eve. He shows him all the animals that live on the earth and has Adam name them. And I think it's because he needed Adam to realize that you will not get the help you need from anyone other than the helpmate that I'm going to make for you. And Adam, when he sees Eve, he says, finally, this is the flesh of my flesh, the bone of my bone. But he had to see all that other stuff first. In the same way, the law of God, as we learn in Romans, was created as a schoolmaster to show us the level that we would have to attain to be righteous in front of God, and the utter impossibility of that task. If we break one part of the law, we are guilty of it all. It's a load too great to bear. But just like God did with Adam, He showed us all the other options.
Amen.
And then gave us Jesus to say, this is it. Yeah. This is the helpmate that you needed. There are people who will try, nevertheless, to stand in front of God on their own goodness. And it will not work. The only way that we can approach the throne of grace, and the only way that we can approach the throne of grace boldly, is if we are dressed in the righteousness, not of rams and oxes and sheep, but of God's own Son who offered Himself a sacrifice for sin. I'll leave you with this thought. In the book of Revelation, chapter 7, John sees a group of people clothed in white robes. And one of the elders that had been serving as John's tour guide in his tour through the throne room of heaven asked John, he said, "Who are those arrayed in white robes?" And John basically said, "Buddy, I'm new here. I don't know. I saw like dragons coming out of the sea 5 minutes ago. I don't know who these white robed people are. You're going to have to tell me." And the elder said, "These are they which came out of great tribulation."
Amen. They made.
"And have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb." They have taken the robes that they were wearing, and they have washed them in the blood of the Lamb and made them white. Therefore, meaning because they have done that, because they have washed themselves in the blood of the Lamb, therefore are they before the throne of God and serve Him day and night in His temple. Get this. "And He that sitteth on the throne shall dwell among them." How does God balance His judgment with His love? How does He judge sin and yet not destroy us, but show His unending, unconditional love for us? God does that by offering Himself a sacrifice for sin, by pouring out all the judgment for sin upon Himself, and then allowing us to wash our robes and make them white in the blood of the Lamb. And then, and only then, will we be able to stand before the throne of God, to serve Him in His temple, and for God to dwell with us. Aaron and his sons depended on the blood of oxes and lambs and goats. But the Bible tells us, as Dad said Wednesday night, I believe, the blood of animals could never cleanse us from sin. It is only possible for us to stand before God if we are clothed in the righteousness of Jesus, if we are washed by His blood, if we have made our robes white in the blood of the Lamb. I'm glad that I do not have to stand before God on my own. I am glad that my record has been wiped clean, that my sins have been cast as far as the east is from the west, that when God looks at me, when I stand in His holy throne room, when I stand before the judgment seat of God, it will not be what Zack Harold has done right or what I have done wrong. All the holy points that I have tried to accumulate in my lifetime won't mean anything. The only thing that will matter is whether I have trusted and accepted Jesus' sacrifice for my sin. Thank you for your attention.